Number 7, the Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Finance, does she agree with Associate Finance Minister David Seymour that, quote, "I actually think that Brooke Van Velden has saved the taxpayer billions. She's saved the budget for the government," unquote. If so, what are the savings from the changes to pay equity?
The Honourable Nicola Willis.
Mr Speaker, I understand from my colleague Mr Seymour that he was speaking as ACT Leader when he made that statement, not Associate Finance Minister. The words the ACT Leader chose are not what I would choose. I agree that changes being made to pay equity legislation will reduce the Crown's expected future costs from pay equity settlements. There is some important context here. As has been the practice with successive Ministers of Finance, it is my judgment that it is in accordance with the public interest to provide detailed information about this in the full context of the budget. However, to help the member, I can confirm that there is a reduction in projected future costs to the Crown of several $billion. However, there are 2 reasons why the projected costs of pay equity settlements projected by the Treasury have been rising exponentially, and they are not all related to the changes in the bill which the government is progressing. The first relates to the costs to the Crown as an employer. Mr Speaker, this government intends to keep meeting those costs. Where claims are made that demonstrate that women employed by the government have been discriminated against on the basis of their gender, it is our government's intention to fully fund those settlements, and we will provide funding for that in our budget. It is also the government's intention to fully uphold settlements. You're getting impatient, but they want the information, I tell you.
I am.
But the second issue, Mr Speaker, relates to the way that the government responds to claims made against private sector employers. The last government established an expectation that those costs would be fully met by the Crown, and that is not our expectation.
Good. I think supplementaries from the Minister's own side might help with that. The Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
Supplementary. When did she first receive advice by the New Zealand Treasury on the potential savings from changing the law to cancel 33 active pay equity claims?
Mr Speaker, I have been receiving briefing about the projected future costs of pay equity settlements, as I recall, from within my first days as Minister of Finance. And what I do recall observing, Mr Speaker, was that those projected costs were far, far greater than I had ever appreciated, and far greater than I think Parliament appreciated when it first passed the pay equity reforms in 2020. And as I just said, in particular related to a cabinet decision made by the last government that it would fully meet the costs of successful claims against private sector employers. That is to say, Mr Speaker, the taxpayer being a backstop for employers found to have discriminated against women on the basis of their gender.
Supplementary. Does she stand by her statement that, quote, "We are committed to maintaining stability for New Zealanders by continuing to invest in essential frontline services," unquote? And if so, how is cancelling the pay equity claim for 75,000 teachers investing in the front line?
That's right.
Mr Speaker, I stand by all my statements. As I have said, it remains the government's solemn commitment that where pay equity claims are proven against the government as an employer, for example, as the employer of teachers, if a pay equity claim is proven that teachers have been discriminated against on the basis of their gender, then we will meet the costs of that settlement. But it's important to note, Mr Speaker, that workforces advance their working conditions and their pay through a number of channels. One of them is pay equity, and that should relate to gender discrimination. The other, second, very important channel is through normal bargaining. That's how workers bargain for improved conditions and improved pay. And yes, I can confirm the government has put aside funding in our budget to meet the costs of future teacher bargaining.
Supplementary, the Honourable Jenny Anderson.
What is she doing to assist the additional 9,000 women who are unemployed compared to this time last year? And how will cutting women's pay incentivise them into work?
Mr. Speaker, I object to the statement made in the latter half of that question, which is untrue. We are not doing that. Because what the member is referring to is claims that have been made that have not been proven. Where there have been settlements, Mr. Speaker, the government is continuing to fully fund the upholding of those settlements. And second, Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to allow claims to progress where discrimination can be proved on the basis of gender. So, Mr. Speaker, those sorts of outlandish statements undermine the credibility of the member and her party.
Point of order, the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, throughout this question, the Minister of Finance has given incredibly long answers that extend well beyond the scope of the question, including insulting the people who are asking the question. I simply ask, you've been quite hard on our side of the House today, I simply ask that you apply that standard to the other side of the House and that ministers answer the questions that they're asked and that they refrain from insulting the people who are asking what are very fair and legitimate questions about a bill that's going through the House under urgency with no public scrutiny.
Thank you. Just before we hear from you, Mr Bishop, I will hear from you. I just asked the member to reflect, the Leader of the Opposition to reflect that the last question that was asked was very wide of the wicket and didn't relate to any previous answer. I was about to stop it, but then thought, no, it's a big issue, let it run on. The Honourable Chris Bishop. Okay. The Honourable Barbara Evans.
Does she stand by her statement from the 2nd of May 2024, quote, "In the past few years, a substantial number of public sector claims have been settled and the task force has supported agencies to build up their expertise and knowledge of their obligations. It is a sign of success," unquote. If so, what has changed since May 2024 that requires legislation to be passed under urgency before her budget?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I stand by that statement because it remains the case that those settlements that have been reached will be upheld. But also, it is the case that the expertise that was built up by public servants through the claim process is partly what has informed the government's decision to refine this Act. Because what we found, Mr. Speaker, was that claims were being able to be progressed across a range of issues that went beyond the intended scope as it related to discrimination on the basis of sex. And, Mr. Speaker, finally, what I would make clear is that we are passing this legislation under urgency in order to provide absolute clarity and in order claims to once again be submitted. It is not the case that this is required for the budget, because actually the decisions made by Cabinet were enough to put the financial implications into the budget. The legislation did not need to be passed in order for that to happen.
Demetri, what claims were outside the scope of the legislation that required the legislation to now change urgently before her budget?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's long been the practice of this House that we won't make legal judgments about which claims may or may not be successful in future.
Just said there were. Just make it. Supplementary. What is more important, saving her budget or ensuring women are paid enough?
Mr. Speaker, I reject the characterisation in the first part of the question. In answer to the second part of the question, I stand by the statements I have made for several years, which is that I wish to see women be advanced and I wish to see them have equal rights and opportunities to men. And it remains my view that women don't always have equal rights and opportunities to men, and that is why we are entrenching a workable pay equity regime that, by the way, is one of the most progressive in the world as it stands in the legislation we're advancing today, so that where women are being discriminated against on the basis of their gender, they can make claims and have them settled.
Before I call the Honourable Barbara Evans, I have been notified that the answer to this question, given the nature of the question, may be a little longer than usual. The Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
Whakatae te lewa, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Finance, when did she first consider the pay equity changes for inclusion in Budget 2025? And what modelling did she receive, if any, on the number of workers likely to be affected by the Equal Pay Amendment Bill?
The Honourable Nicola Willis.
Mr Speaker, upon becoming Finance Minister in December 2023, I was quickly made aware by Treasury of the amount of money that was built into the government's forecasts to meet future pay equity settlements. I was shocked by the size of the number, which had not been previously disclosed publicly and which had grown very rapidly. A significant portion of the money was set aside for the government to fund what is known as the funded sector, which is the non-government sector settlements. This is private sector, NGO or community service providers that the government contracts and therefore does not employ as its workers. The previous government had made a decision that meant the full costs of these settlements were being factored into the books, as well as the actual public sector settlements that the government wasn't obligated to fund. I took some time to receive advice on these issues, and I took proposals to Cabinet in April 2024 to adjust expectations around funded sector claims. This lessened the projected cost to the Crown of these claims, but only by a relatively small amount. As this pay equity reset was being implemented last year, it became clear that there were deeper, more underlying issues with the Act, which had a broad scope and had departed from its original purpose of addressing genuine sex-based discrimination. Last December, the Cabinet Strategy Committee discussed the high-level legislative settings for pay equity and indicated a preference to confront those underlying issues quickly. Mr Speaker, I outline all of this to make clear that in answer to the first part of the primary question, changes to pay equity settings were considered through last year and into this year, and as that work progressed since last December's Cabinet discussion, the financial implications were taken into account in Budget 2025 discussions. And in answer to the second part of the member's question, with regard to the specific bill, I had previously received advice from Treasury about the number of workers involved in particular claims, but that is not the same as what the member is asking. By its very nature, and like other employment legislation, the bill affects all workers because anyone can consider their rights to make a claim.
Yep. Point of order, the Honourable Kira McNulty.
That question was answered in about 20 seconds. The first minute and a half was totally unnecessary, and giving you a prior warning that there's going to be a longer answer is proper process if the whole answer is required to address the question. It was not. That was abused as a way to try and rewrite history or to put forward their perspective as to what happened. That wasn't the primary question. The minute the Minister said in answer to your question, that's when the answer actually started.
That is the opinion of the member. It's not the way I heard it. And I've read the primary and would ask the member to do the same. I don't think the Minister stepped outside what is required to answer that question. I think it was an appropriate courtesy of the House to inform the House it would be slightly longer, but quite frankly, not all that much longer. The Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
Supplementary. How many women will lose the right to make a pay equity claim under these changes?
Good question. Mr Speaker, any woman who can demonstrate that she has a case with merit that she was discriminated against in her pay on the basis of her sex will be able to make a claim under this legislation. It will be a legal judgment as to which cases meet that test, and it is not for me in this House to offer a legal judgment.
So how were the Treasury able to quantify the savings from this policy if she doesn't actually know how many women will be affected?
Mr Speaker, what the Treasury had done as a practice under the last government was that because the last government did not allocate any funding in its operating allowances for pay equity settlements, did not allocate any money for those settlements, the Treasury formed a view that it was likely that those costs would otherwise be incurred by the Crown, and so they put them in the forecast. That is, they affected the surplus and deficit position. They formed those forecasts, I am advised, on an assessment of what they thought the claims would be, how many workers they thought would be affected and what the costs were. But of course the ultimate number of people that would be affected was determined by whether or not those claims were successful.
Supplementary. Does she stand by her statement that, quote, pay equity processes should be used for genuine issues of discrimination, unquote? And if so, which of the 33 cancelled claims were not genuine discrimination?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I stand by my statement.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston.
Can I ask the Minister, will any person with a pay equity claim be able to make one under the new legislation, or have some engaged in hyperbolic, distracting psychobabble?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do think it is of regret that members opposite with a responsibility to their communities, I think, have made relatively misleading statements about the rights that are now available to New Zealand women who still have the right to equal pay and the right to make pay equity settlements, contrary to what some members opposite are trying to allege.
I beg your pardon? Are you now challenging my rulings of the House? Well, there wasn't, and it's not for you to make them or to require them, other than through a point of order. Barbara Edmonds.
Supplementary. How can she stand by her position that she is dedicated to pay equity when Te Tai Tokerau Principals Association have called it an appalling slap in the face for women, and Hospice New Zealand calls these changes a real kick in the guts?
That's right.
Because, Mr. Speaker, the government has a very clear position that it is upholding settlements for existing pay equity claims, and furthermore has created a transparent, workable, practical process for future claims to be raised. And what's more, because we have advanced that legislation rapidly, people will be able to submit claims the minute the Governor-General gives assent.
Supplementary.
Question 4.
Supplementary. Supplementary.
Oh, supplementary.
Thank you.
You're the next question as well.
Yes, thank you. Which of the 33 pay equity claims were not based on genuine discrimination?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm being asked for a legal judgment, what it is not for me to give. But I would also note that it is not simply an issue of whether the claims have merit.
Sorry. I can't have people chipping at me for not intervening in a question when it's very hard to hear the answer because of the barrage that's being directed at the Minister answering.
I would also note that it's not simply an issue of which claims progress, and I'm advised that it's expected that a number of claims will continue to progress. It is a matter of, once they are in progress, how they are assessed and the comparators that are used. And the government's concern has been that other market-based factors were being brought into the assessment. This law should be about gender and sex discrimination, not issues that are more properly dealt with through the normal bargaining process.
Question number 4, the Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
For Yuxia, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Finance, does she stand by her statement this morning that, quote, we need to keep pay equity claims able to be lodged and able to be progressed where there are claims genuinely based on gender-based discrimination, unquote? If so, which of the 33 cancelled pay equity claims does she not think are genuine, if any?
The Honourable Nicola Willis.
Mr. Speaker, yes. And in answer to the second part of the question, it is not for me to make a legal judgment to determine which claims are genuine. It is a legal question that will be considered by those negotiating a settlement, or ultimately the Employment Relations Authority. Under the Act, claims with merit will be progressed.
Supplementary. If the government pays several $1 billion less in pay equity payments, does that mean women will receive several $1 billion less?
No, Mr. Speaker, and I am grateful for the question because the member misunderstands the nature of contingencies. It is good budgeting practice.
That's enough.
It is good budgeting practice for the Treasury to forecast potential costs that on the basis of probabilities may occur. Therefore, under the last government, it was the practice that money was being put in the forecast, not revealed to New Zealanders, allowing for the fact that there could be significant future settlements. Whether or not those settlements would occur and the size thereof was still a matter to be determined through negotiations. I'd note, Mr. Speaker, that a number of the claims that were in progress had become bogged down due to the lack of clarity in the pay equity regime and the different approaches that employers and employees were taking to negotiating those claims. We now have a clear system, a transparent system, and we fully accept there will be future pay equity settlements.
If the system was so bogged down, how were there 10 equity pay settlements done under the last term?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is the case that in the first instance there were a number of claims where the government was the employer and where the government was therefore at the negotiating table with public sector unions. Those settlements, Mr. Speaker, stand. And for the benefit of those opposite who seem to be ignorant of the fact, that has resulted in pay increases for nurses, for social workers, for teacher aides, for librarians, for a number of women-dominated professions, and our government has retained every single dollar of funding needed to honour those settlements.
Supplementary. Why did she call advocates for women being paid enough a grievance industry?
Mr. Speaker, what I referred to was the fact that pay equity regime should be used and was intended to be used for settling claims that relate to sex-based discrimination. It is absolutely the case that significant groups of workers in the New Zealand economy, not just those dominated by women, but a number of groups, wish to see their pay increased. And we have a number of mechanisms for achieving this. The principal one is through negotiation between employers and employees. It is appropriate that unions and others use those mechanisms to argue for further pay. And here's the other thing, Mr. Speaker. The best way to ensure that all New Zealanders can look forward to growing wages is to have a strong, growing economy in which employers can afford to pay their people more. And that's what we're doing.
You've got to keep the answers concise, as the questions should be.
Supplementary. Are underpaid plunket nurses or underpaid hospice nurses a grievance industry?
Mr. Speaker, if groups of workers have had their work undervalued and underpaid as a consequence of gender-based discrimination, then it is appropriate that they make pay equity claims and that their claims be judged according to whether or not there has been sex-based discrimination. Mr. Speaker, it is self-evident that there are a number of issues in an economy which can lead to pay levels. They relate to where people work, the industry in which they work, the qualifications required, the skills required. There are all number of factors that are brought to bear on the pay that people receive. To ignorantly claim it's all down to pay equity is just wrong.
Supplementary.
Supplementary, the Honourable David Seymour.
What are some of the factors that lead to growing wages in any economy, and do they include a Byzantine arrangement for setting pay through overly complex labour laws?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member makes a good point. There are two things happening here. One is about gender-based discrimination and how we make sure there is a clear process for negotiating settlements to amend for that. The other is how we grow wages in this economy. And the way to do that is to have more productivity, more growth, employers who are better able to pay their people more. Because while others would like to labour under the illusion, the truth is there is no magic pot of money available to wipe every tear from every eye. Actually, a country must always live within its means.
Supplementary.
Honourable Barbara Evans.
Why is she continuing to gaslight the estimated 150,000 women who are saving her budget, or like always...
I think if the member just thinks about the ruling that I read out at the start of question time today, and she might, in considering that, like to rephrase that question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is she continuing to downplay the very real concerns of hundreds of thousands of women to save her budget, or like always, everyone else is wrong, but Nicola Willis is right?
Mr. Speaker, I am simply making it clear to those who have been misled by many claims made in the past few days that our government is upholding protections for equal pay in law, that we are upholding pay equity settlements, and that we are both funding and putting in place a good system for resolving future pay equity claims. Beyond that, Mr. Speaker, it is rich for the member opposite to talk about saving budgets. I'll tell you the biggest constraint on this government's budget. It is this. We believe in responsible fiscal management and don't believe that simply spending more, taxing more and borrowing more is the path to economic nirvana. That way lies terror.
Question 5, the Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
Nor ear, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Finance, does she agree with Christopher Luxon when describing FamilyBoost that, quote, our viewers, it doesn't cost much more to administer, unquote? If so, how much has been spent on administering the scheme relative to the amount paid out?
Mr. Speaker, yes, in context, which in this case was a quote made in opposition long before Inland Revenue had given any advice. To the second part, as the member will know from working at IR, there is always a cost to administer tax credits and rebates, especially with a new scheme. For FamilyBoost, it was important to have systems in place to ensure integrity, make it easy to apply, deal with phone calls, and provide support and education for parents to claim what they are entitled to. I don't have information on actual administration costs, but IR received $12.1 million this year to administer FamilyBoost, reducing in future years, and so far, Mr. Speaker, more than 58,000 families have benefited from this payment, and I want to see many more benefited from it in the months ahead.
More than a quarter. Have the admin costs of $14 million this year proven to be value for money, since only half the number of families have taken up FamilyBoost and only $48 million has been paid out?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to see more families benefiting from this scheme, which puts cash direct in the bank accounts of people with high early childhood education costs. And that's why I have asked Inland Revenue to provide me urgent advice on changes we can make to the scheme to ensure more New Zealand families can benefit from it. And I look forward to making announcements about that in June. And Mr. Speaker, the alternative, of course, is the approach that member proposes, in which 0 families would get a FamilyBoost payment.
It's not true. Supplementary. When she said, quote, I have told Inland Revenue I expect the costs to fall in coming years, unquote, does that mean she has instructed Inland Revenue to spend less than the $11 million she has already allocated for admin costs in the next year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is wonderful to see that we are now finally agreeing that it is always appropriate to look for efficiencies and reductions in government spending that aren't driving value. That is my baseline expectation of every government agency. Look for efficiency, do it with less money if you possibly can, and I have exactly the same expectation of the Inland Revenue Department.
Supplementary. Can she confirm that any money that hasn't been paid out to families for FamilyBoost this year will be returned to the government, and Budget 2025 will reflect this?
Mr. Speaker, Budget 2025 will be revealed on Budget Day, just a few sleeps to go. But what I have made clear is that the indications of the amount that we wanted to spend on this scheme remain my intentions, and what I want to see is many more families benefiting from this scheme. I want those dollars in the bank accounts of Kiwi families who are struggling with the cost of living. They like this scheme, we just need more of them to be eligible for it.
Supplementary. When will the remainder of the 100,000 families she promised FamilyBoost receive it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, that's subject to future announcements.
Supplementary. When will she admit that this policy failure has let down working families, just like she has let down working women across the country?
No, sorry. Just ask the question again.
Supplementary. When will she admit that this policy failure has let down working families?
Well, Mr Speaker, I disagree with several characterisations in that question. You should stand against it.
Jacinda, did you?
The question is to answer from a government perspective, not attack other members in the House. It's the final warning on that one. Questions, the first name of the Honourable Barbara Emmons.
Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Finance, does she stand by her statement about the pay equity changes that, quote, the process we have set up is fair, it's robust, unquote? If so, how is cancelling 33 pay equity claims under urgency fair?
The Honourable Chris Bishop.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, yes, I stand by my statement. We've made changes to the pay equity system that make it fairer and return it to its intended purpose, addressing gender-based pay discrimination. Despite what some may have suggested, any claims that have already been settled remain in place and fully funded. Claims that had not yet been settled under the old system have been discontinued because it is not practical to have two different systems operating at once. That would create uncertainty and unfairness.
Supplementary. Was accounting for the fiscal savings in her budget the reason why urgency was used to cancel 33 active pay equity claims?
No.
Supplementary. How does using urgency address the warning she received from Treasury officials on the 14th of December 2023 that, quote, while it would be possible to legislate to apply any new process to existing claims, such a retrospective action would need to be justified, unquote?
Well, the government did think it was justified, which is why the government legislated.
Supplementary. How can she justify the cancellation of 180,000 workers' pay equity claims when many, like secondary school teachers, will be locked out of lodging a claim under the new rules?
Existing claims have been discontinued, but the law has been reset to allow claims to be resubmitted.
Supplementary. Does she agree with advice from the Treasury that, quote, amending the legislation in a way that had the potential to reduce the fiscal cost would be seen as a degradation of the rights of those female-dominated occupations that have not yet raised a claim, unquote?
No, because pay equity claims continue to exist, and in fact we have set aside money to honour existing claims that have been settled and future claims.
Why did she not take any action to protect the rights of those female-dominated occupations, given the warning from the Treasury that those rights would be degraded, or was saving her budget more important?
I disagree with the characterisation. Pay equity is important, as is the Equal Pay Act 1972, and we are honouring the commitments in that Act.
Question.